Hi everyone, it's Mr. Henderson. We're going to begin in on the French Revolution today after you've watched your introduction video, kind of giving you an overview, a very brief one, about what we're going to experience throughout this 10-year revolution. Today we're going to start in on Lesson 1, The French Revolution Begins, and we're going to start here in 1789. This is Module 13.1, and this is going to be Part A. I'm going to break this into two parts for both of these lessons because there's a lot packed into these. And it's often one of our students' most confusing lessons or modules because there are a lot of moving parts to this. So we're going to slow it down a bit and break this into two parts for each lesson. This is Lesson 1, Part A. We'll cover the old order and the forces of change. And if you want to look into your books, your online book, this is pages 516 to 520. The objectives we want to cover for this lesson and Part A is to be able to describe the social divisions of France's old order, be able to list France's economic troubles in 1789, and also explain why Louis XVI is going to call the Estates General in the first place. Some questions we might want to be able to answer by the end of this lesson, Part A. What was the social structure of the old regime in France? What economic troubles did France face in 1789, and how did they lead to further unrest? And also, what actions did delegates of the Third Estate take when the Estates General met in 1789? In the early 1700s, if again we have to use history as our building blocks, remember back to the Enlightenment. In the early 1700s, France was the center of the Enlightenment, the heart of the Enlightenment, particularly in Paris. But by the late 1700s, it's going to be the heart of revolution. In order to understand how this is going to happen, let's first talk about the old order. We need to understand France's social structure. France had what's known as a caste system, set up in three different levels. This was the French political and social system before the revolution began, broken up into three different tiers that the French are going to call estates. Simply, they're known as the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. Another name in France for this caste system, the old order, is the ancien regime. So let's talk about these different tiers of the caste system of the old order. At the top, the first estate was the clergy. These people were members of the church, priests, monks, nuns. The second estate are your nobles. These are landowners. These are people who have had titles granted to them and have been passed on from generation to generation. And finally, the third estate is made up of the rest of the population in France. There is a group within this known as the bourgeoisie. You may call them those rich peasants, the working class, and then your legitimate peasants, the serfs, the ones who work the land. The first estate, the clergy, they're going to have access to high offices, exemptions from most taxes, meaning they don't have to pay. They make up less than 1% of the entire population of France, and yet they owned nearly 10% of all the land. They did do things that actually made them positive in society, and that is that they provided an education and relief for the poor. So at least they're doing something for the few taxes they're paying. But nonetheless, they contributed less than 2% of their entire income to the government. So start thinking, okay, well, where's the government going to get its money? This group also scorned the Enlightenment ideals. Remember what we talked about. Governments and churches tried to censor Enlightenment writers and thinkers. and put a squelch to Enlightenment ideas. The second estate is the nobility. They too had access to high offices, exemptions from most taxes. They make up less than 2% of the population. And yet they own 20% of the land. So again, start keeping tally. The clergy, first estate, was 1% of the population. The second estate, the nobility, is 2% of the population. So far we've only covered 3% of the population. And owning here 20% of the land, paired with 10% owned by the first estate clergies, 3% of the population, controlling 30% of all the land in France. And obviously, this group as well scorned Enlightenment ideals. It meant change to their lifestyle and was a threat to their power. So you may want to ask yourself, and you can write this in your notes, why did members of the first and second estate scorn Enlightenment ideals? Why did they dislike them? Why did they hate these beliefs? Carrying on, the third estate has a few different groups within it. As I talked about before, the bourgeoisie is what you might call the rich peasants. They were just the tip of the iceberg to what makes up 97% of the rest of the population in France. The bourgeoisie is what we today might call the middle class. These were people like bankers, professionals, skilled artisans. There were lawyers. There were tutors. Groups like that. There were very few of these people within the population. Normally, they are well educated, which is unlike the others in this group. And many even were able to become wealthy. However, they're going to pay up to 50% of their entire income in taxes. Then there's the working class. These are your tradesmen, your apprentices, laborers. They can make good money when seasons are at a certain time, depending on what their jobs are. And also, it's just when somebody kind of needs work. So they get paid incredibly low wages, and they're often not working. They're often unemployed, which means no money at all coming in. The last group is more than 80% of the population. That's huge. They paid taxes to the nobles, church, and the crown. They resented the rich, and they were very eager for change. All of these groups are heavily taxed. All of these groups are going to lack privileges, and every single one of them are going to embrace the Enlightenment ideals. And think about what the Enlightenment ideals really began with: a revolution in ideas. And this is going to turn into a revolution in real life. One bourgeoisie member once wrote, "What is the third estate? They are everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Absolutely nothing. But what does it want to be? Just something." So to give you a bit of a visual, this is what we're talking about in terms of population. First estate, the green sliver. Second estate, the blue. And the large chunk of the pie there is the third estate. And yet here's the land distribution. Notice what the yellow is. That's the royal family. That's the government. That's the crown. The gray sliver, third estate, is right here. It's zero. It's just nothing. So when you go back to what that bourgeoisie citizen said, what has the third estate been up until now? Nothing. Well, when is that man talking? That's coming up. To give you another visual of what this might look like, here is what 3% of the United States population is. Essentially, all of the people in New Jersey. Imagine them owning all of this land all the way over to Missouri, Iowa, Arkansas, Minnesota, and Louisiana. They own all of this themselves. And then this over here, that's not for you. That's for the government to own. And you own nothing. But let's go into talking about what are some of the forces of change here. One of the major causes of the French Revolution was increasing economic troubles. This is due in part to a long period of deficit spending. Deficit spending is a situation in which a government spends more money than it takes in. What this means is the treasury of a government might be empty, or I'm just using that as an example here. So they would go to a lender, a bank, and often other governments or religious institutions. And they would ask to borrow that money. Now, obviously, what that does is it puts money in their treasury. But again, that money doesn't belong to them. So that increases their debt, meaning they're going to have to pay that back. The more money they borrow to put into their treasury to pay for things, the more debt they're going to have. But simply paying back that debt isn't all that a government would have to pay, or you or I. Think of it much like a credit card if you know how that works. You're getting money that doesn't belong to you to use right now, but you have to pay it back. And that money comes along with what's known as interest. May not be double, like what I'm showing here, but you're going to be paying more money back than what you borrowed. So if you're not going to use the money that you borrow to make more money for you, and you're just going to use it to spend, you're going to end up in a tough situation, just like France did. Now, France was deeply in debt, mainly because of their participation in the American Revolution, but also a long, long list of wars that the French had been fighting against the British, not only in the continent of Europe, and obviously over in the new Americas, but also in other places around the world. In order to continue operations, the government has to borrow that money. But unfortunately, another big problem that's going to lead to this economic decline is several years of bad harvest brought on by terrible winters, what many historians would later call a mini ice age that swept through Europe, just debilitating the ability for farmers and landowners and peasants to get crops. Well, this has a major impact because it causes rising food prices, and it also is going to bring hunger to the poorest citizens. It would be daily across the country that people would attack bread carts, attack owners of bakeries, accusing them of hoarding goods and price gouging. Things were becoming violent often. So how might the government be able to solve this financial crisis? Well, you look around at who owns the most wealth and the most land and pays very little in taxes and seems to never have a problem getting food or wearing clothes or sleeping under a roof. You may think they might be able to help. However, the clergy and the nobles were fiercely against increased taxes. Another major reason, or another major cause of the French Revolution, is weak leadership. Louis XVI, the King of France, was a very indecisive king. He would often prefer that his advisors lead the government for him. He was known to follow the advice of the last person that he talked to, going from one to the next. Well, what do you think about that? Well, what do you think about this? He married Marie Antoinette, a foreign bride. At the age of 15, she was only 14. He's going to take over as King of France at the age of 19, very young. And the truth is, he never really wanted that much to be, maybe to be king, but not have the responsibilities of the king. He was very disinterested as a child, a bit odd. And Marie Antoinette was a terrible influence on him. As I said before, he would often follow the advice of the last person he talked to. And who would he most often talk to last on any given day? His wife, as he lied down in bed to end the day. And she gave him terrible advice. She was a terrible money spender. spent like crazy, gambling, card games, throwing lavish parties and giving away gifts, buying gowns and jewels for herself and her friends. This, around France, particularly in Paris, earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. King Louis XVI did make one good decision, though. He chose Jacques Necker as his financial advisor. Jacques Necker was a third estate banker. He was one of the people. So when he was chosen, not from a noble family, but from the third estate citizens thought, hey, here's our chance. Things are going to begin to change because Jacques Necker will be in the ear of the king and be able to convince him to do things like reduce his spending and reform government spending, and also abolish harsh tariffs on imported goods that made prices far too expensive, particularly food. Most importantly, Jacques Necker is going to advise the king to increase the taxes on the first and second estate. But as we said previously, the clergy and the nobles, the first and second estates, are strongly, vehemently against increased taxes. They refuse to pay new taxes. So as Jacques Necker is urging the king to do this, and the king attempts to raise these taxes, the first and second estates say no, absolutely not. They demanded an estates general to be called to approve the new taxes. The estates general was a gathering of delegates from all of the estates, attending proportionately based on the size of their particular estate. So who had the fewest delegates? The first estate. Who had the second fewest? The second estate. And who had by far the most delegates? The third estate. This is something that rarely ever happens, where you have a group that is going to challenge a king, because the king commanded the military. The king was an absolute ruler. In fact, this legislative body, made up of representatives from the three estates, this is the first time that is going to be called in 175 years. But as we see here, the forces of change are already rolling. France is in dire debt. As we saw from the introduction and setting the stage, there are deep social and cultural problems amongst the third estate. The Enlightenment gave motivation, and it had started here in Paris, in the heart of France. And it was adopted by the Americans, and it led to the American Revolution. And who helped the Americans win? In fact, part of the debt is because the French helped the Americans win. So it was these people who were in America fighting. It was the third estate. Who do you think makes up the army? Who do you think makes up the military? Who do you think was sent to America? These third estaters. And then they come back to their own country where they can barely eat or clothe themselves or feed their children or put a roof over their heads. They're going to demand change. The forces of change are underway. In our next section, or in part B of lesson 1, we'll see the dawn of the revolution and a great fear sweep across France.